So Egypt just did the unthinkable. They have just joined the International Court of Justice lawsuit that was filed by South Africa. Now, is this the beginning of the end of the Israeli-Egyptian relationship, the long-standing, multi-decade peace agreement? Well, allow me to explain. Things in the Middle East are never, ever, ever what they seem. And this is a really good example. Now, Egypt joining this lawsuit now is the real question you should be asking yourself. Why did the Egyptians wait until May of 2024 to join this lawsuit? Why not do this months ago, weeks ago? Why now? Is this because of their love for the Palestinians? What has changed now versus a week ago? Allow me to explain. Now, there's a few factors in play here. Some of them are political, some of them are PR related, and some of them are strategic. And none of them, not a shred of them, has anything to do with the Palestinians or the Palestinian issue whatsoever. So, number one, the Egyptians are watching the Israelis take the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing. Now, as I just remembered, Rafah on the Palestinian side has nothing to do with the Egyptian border. So Egypt doesn't have any claim that the Israelis are breaching the peace agreement by taking control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing, which, by the way, they had for years until they give it back for some reason. God knows why. So the Israelis are winning the war. They're conquering back certain land that they held before. And the Egyptians are basically losing control because since the Israelis backed out, the real control of that Rafah crossing was at Egypt's hands. Egypt controlled the Rafah crossing. And now that the Israelis are sitting on the Palestinian side, the Egyptian control has officially ended. Plus, now they got the Israelis sitting on their fence. Because next after the Rafah crossing is the Sinai Peninsula, and that's not a huge thing the Egyptians really would like to have. Losing control, getting the Israeli military on their border again. But that's about 10% of the story. 90% of the story has to do with every single item I'm about to tell right now, and none of them has to do with the Palestinians. So the other part here is that the Egyptians are playing a game of signaling with the Hamas, because the Egyptians are not sure if Hamas will survive this or not. They're not sure. So they can't go all in any direction. So they're signaling to Hamas, hey, we're not part of this. We're not playing ball with the Israelis and Americans. We're absolutely on your side. So that if Hamas survives this, which may or may not be the case, Hamas is going to maintain the kind of peace agreement they have with Egypt. Egypt and Hamas basically have a deal in which they don't intervene in any of their business. The Egyptians don't help the Israelis, and Hamas doesn't help the Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize the government in Egypt, which is very fragile. This is just a sign from the Egyptians to Hamas, basically letting them know, hey guys, we still respect the deal. If you guys end up surviving this, don't start shit in Egypt. We're still good. Now, the most important reason, though, has to do with the Palestinian refugees, potentially. If Israel pushes into Rafah, there's going to be loads of refugees potentially going through the border into the Sinai Peninsula. That is a horror scenario for the Egyptians. Not because they lack land, which they have plenty of, not because they lack space, not because they hate the Palestinians. It's because there's going to be plenty of Hamas folk that are going to be embedded in those refugees. One of the main problems for the Israelis so far in the war was to distinguish which are the civilian and which is the Hamas fighter. You can't tell. It's very, very hard. So the flood of refugees that might go from Rafah into Sinai Peninsula is going to have a lot of Hamas people in them. And those Hamas people will rejoin the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and they're going to absolutely topple this government within 5 years. Once that happens, the countdown to the death of this regime in Egypt starts. This is a no-go for them. And on top of it, there's the public perception in Egypt. Even though Egypt has a peace deal with Israel for many, many years, the Egyptian street absolutely despises the Israelis before this war started. Now they despise the Israelis even more. So the Egyptian street is absolutely anti-Israeli in the most horrible way you can imagine. They hate the Israelis. They despise the Israelis. And even though Sisi is a president for life, essentially, or until he's dethroned, a king that is popular has much, much higher chances of survival than an unpopular king. And this is just a play to show the Egyptian public that, hey, we're not playing with what Israel is doing in Gaza. Now, On top of it, over the past few days, the Egyptians absolutely closed the border from their end, preventing from aid going into Gaza. Why would they do that? If they love the Palestinians so much, if they want to help the Palestinian cause so much, why would the Egyptians potentially cause a humanitarian crisis in Gaza by closing the border now? That is because they want that crisis to happen while the Israelis are trying to take Rafah, so it will push the Israelis to basically back out, say, hey, okay, we can't do this. People are starving, they don't have any water. So the Egyptians are essentially causing a humanitarian crisis in Gaza by closing off the border, and they're pushing on the political stage against the Israelis, hoping that they get to keep Rafah crossing. In the best case scenario for Egypt would be keep Rafah crossing in their control and kill Hamas. That would be the dream scenario for Egypt, because don't forget, the Egyptians and the Israelis have one common enemy, which is Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel is not in any sort of jeopardy. Simply put, the Egyptians need the Israelis allies and they need the US support. This whole peace agreement is intact, not because Egypt is somehow forced into it. It's because it's in the best interest of Egypt, and that hasn't changed. So don't be fooled by this smokescreen. On the other hand, you have Hamas essentially spinning right now and using this spin in Israeli media, basically saying, hey, if you guys take Rafah, that wouldn't change anything. We're still good. So they're trying to bluff the Israelis into thinking, well, we're going to lose all these soldiers in Rafah and we're going to cause all this international mayhem over something that we don't benefit anything from. And that spin essentially has been picked up by anti-Benjamin Netanyahu opposers, I guess, in the Israeli media, who are spinning this essentially saying, hey, we shouldn't go into Rafah because we're going to lose, essentially pushing for the end of the war at its current configuration so that they can replace Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. So the opposition is literally, at this point, is willing to lose the war, so that loss causes them to replace Benjamin Netanyahu. So as you can see, it's not just the US who is playing internal politics, overriding and actually overshadowing actual strategic needs. It happens everywhere. And this is another prime example. The reality is that whoever closes that gate is going to control the entire Gaza. If the Israelis get a hold of Rafah proper, they will shut down the gate. There's not going to be any smuggling of weapons. There's not going to be any movement of goods. If the Israelis sit on the Rafah crossing, they will own Gaza and they will de facto control everything. Rafah is the key to Gaza, which begs the question, why would the Israelis leave it to last and not start with it? That's a huge strategic question that I have no answer to, and it seems like a huge oversight by the Israelis. Now, there's going to be a lot of spins right now that you're going to hear in mainstream media. One of them was the Hamas spin. Oh, we agreed to a ceasefire that we have proposed and the Israelis have never seen. And that ceasefire essentially is just the surrender of the Israelis. The Israelis say no, obviously, and then the Egyptians and Hamas can say, well, the Israelis are stopping the ceasefire. Obviously, that's just designed to pressure Israel. That didn't really work and didn't catch on mainstream media. So right now, you have Hamas stalling, waiting, trying to buy time, a couple of weeks maybe, for the Israelis to get stopped by the international community. And what the US has been doing has not been helping, let's be honest. So the US is in a survival campaign right now. They're losing, this current administration is losing to Donald Trump. That's just the reality. And they know that most voters basically form their opinions around June and July, which is coming up. This is the time that people select who they're going to vote for. And that's why you're seeing this U-turn from the US going from full-on support to, hey, we're delaying weapons unless you stop this Rafah entrance. So basically, don't go into Rafah. We're going to keep supporting you. Go into Rafah. We don't know if we can support this. So this U-turn is based on US internal politics. Now, can they follow through on this? Probably not. I'll explain why. If the Biden administration goes too far with this, Trump is going to outflank them, basically saying, he's already started, by the way. He's going to say, well, you know, we wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have abandoned the Israelis. I wouldn't have done this. This is betrayal. So Trump is waiting on the flank. So they can only go so far with this. They can't really go full force. On top of it, you have the Jewish vote in the US, which will absolutely turn if they continue this path. And on top of it, you actually have some US dip interests in the Middle East. So this whole thing doesn't do any justice for the US strategically. And if they're going to keep doing this too hard, Trump is going to capitalize on this and actually win the election because of what they're doing. So they're in a tough spot. On top of it, we have Iran. Now, Iran has gone back to their classic way of waging war, sitting in the shadows, using Hezbollah. Well, the past few days, ever since the Israelis set foot into Rafah, Hezbollah increased significantly their attacks on the north of Israel. Now, they haven't gone full on war. They don't want that. But they're signaling to the Israelis, hey, if you go into Rafah, we're going to turn up the heat. It's Iran's way of gently Hail Marying into the end zone, hoping something catches and they can save Hamas. When in fact, the Iranians do already understand that Hamas is lost, and they're not too upset about it. For Iran, the Shiite Iran, losing Sunni life is cheap. Sunni life is like disposable, one-time, single-use weapons they use. They think of them like drones. So Hamas will be lost. They still have the Houthi rebels. They have Hezbollah, which is actually a Shiite organization, which is the one they really want to keep and maintain and protect. No Shiite life will be lost to protect Hamas. This is the concept of Iran. They'll do a little bit to try and kind of show that they're helping, but they're not going to commit like strategic suicide to help Hamas. So over the course of the next few days, we will see how things turn up. If the Israelis keep on pushing into Rafah and they ignore all this smoke, all this noise, they will win a strategic win in this war, a key win in this war. If they surrender to the international pressure, to the US pressure, it's going to be a huge mistake, both for Israel and the Americans, that will be driven mainly by political consideration, and that will be a massive mistake. Stay tuned. We're going to find out in a few days.